Hi, this is Josh Bycer from GameWisdom.com. Hope you enjoyed this critical thought, a detailed discussion on game design, and be sure to subscribe and you can pitch future critical thought topics. Alright, everybody, after a few days of some, depressing game industry news, for today's critical thought, we're going to turn to the exciting topic of control schemes. This is going to be based on the post I put up on Game Wisdom, which you'll find a link down below. But a good control scheme for a game is really one of the more underrated aspects of a good game designer. Because when it works, no one will say a word about it. When it doesn't work, you'll have your entire Steam forums of people complaining about it. And coming up with a good control scheme can be a very difficult task depending upon the genre and game in question. For a runner, it's pretty simple. For a 3D action stealth game, that's a different story. And for today, I want to talk about a few of the tips and elements that I found that generally work across the board, regardless of design and genre. Now, there are a few major exceptions. Games that are built on a unique peripheral, such as a joystick for flight games, steering wheels for racing games, something completely customizable like everyone's favorite Steel Battalion controller, and of course, unique peripherals or control devices, such as those that are used for anyone suffering from unique disabilities. But generally speaking, we're going to be looking at things from as most accessible as we can when it comes to designing a UI. So we got a few controllers around here that we're going to be using. The first thing you need to understand when it comes to building a control scheme is the idea of the neutral position. I know we have talked about this on a critical thought. The neutral position is essentially how will someone hold your controller when they're not pushing any buttons. Again, it's kind of hard to see, but typically when I'm holding a controller like this, I have a thumb on my left hand on the left thumbstick, my right hand will have right thumb on the thumbstick, or on usually square or X. Meanwhile, both index fingers are going to be on the left and right triggers respectively. Now, the neutral position is very important because these are the buttons that are going to be within immediate access from someone playing your game. They won't need to shift fingers or shift their entire hand to hit these buttons, and it's going to come into play in a few minutes. Now, some controllers who aren't symmetrical will sometimes have two different feels depending upon where you're holding it. So something like if I can pull this up, there we go. Something like the Xbox controller, if you're going to use the thumbsticks over here, which is kind of hard to look at in reverse, it's different compared to if you want to use just the D-pad and the buttons. And that is a very interesting part about older gamepad design. The N64 controller famously had three essential, grips. You had the two over here for the thumbstick, or I'm sorry, you had the one in the middle for the thumbstick, the one on the left for the D-pad, and then of course the one on the right for the buttons. Now, the history of gamepads, that is a different topic, but this kind of format is usually the standard element for gamepads going forward. And if you're a new designer, it's important to understand just what you're going to be working with in terms of buttons, especially if you're going to port a game from console to PC or vice versa. Now, with that said, the second element that you want to look at when it comes to designing a control scheme are the verbs itself that you're going to use. Obviously, verbs are actions for those of you who miss grammar, but when we're deciding the verbs for your game, again, this is anything and everything that has to be used by a button or commanded by a button. And again, depending upon the genre that we're talking about, you'll have either a very short or a very long list. So, for instance, something like the original Mario, you would have movement, running modifier, jump, a button for shooting fireballs or whatever like that, and of course, ducking, and maybe even something for swimming. Now, even though jumping and swimming both come from the same button, there are still two different commands, or two different actions, which will play into what we're going to talk about next. But the idea is you should have a very firm grasp of anything and everything that the player is going to do in your game, especially, of course, if you are designing it. And like I said, this even includes stuff like inventory management, going into a sub-menu for equipping gear or applying stat points. If it's controlled by a button, you put it on this list. And now comes the interesting point, and that is differentiating or categorizing between primary and secondary actions. A primary action is something that the player is going to be doing constantly through play. This is essentially your core gameplay loop. Going back to Mario, running and jumping would be primary actions. Halo, moving, aiming, shooting, throwing a grenade. Again, pick a game and we can discuss its primary actions. The secondary actions are situational. They are still vital for playing your game, but they're not something that you're going to be using every few seconds. So, sneaking, a button that's used to make your guy, crouch down and move slower would be an example. Let's say selecting spells for a hotbar. Would be another case. Even something like taking a health potion or using a recovery item would also fit here because you're not supposed to be taking a health potion every 5 seconds. You're going to be, mashing your skill buttons if we're talking about Diablo 3. But again, being able to understand what's the difference between a primary and a secondary option is key for when it comes to building your control scheme. And the reason is, when we're talking about your gamepad here, or even your keyboard, what we said a few minutes ago regarding the neutral position is, wherever your hands are in a neutral form, that is typically where your primary actions are going to be. It's why X is traditionally going to be your jump button in a platformer, because whether you're holding it using the thumbsticks or the directional pad, your right thumb will always be resting on usually square or X. It's why in first-person shooters, shooting is always going to be a trigger. Now, there's also a secondary reason for that, and that is the fact that pushing this trigger down is akin to pulling a trigger on a real gun. That's an example of a secondary association, which we'll talk about in a few minutes. But, again, when it comes to primary and secondary actions, primary should become muscle memory. I should never have to look at my gamepad or look at my keyboard or take even a millisecond to think about what key or what button does it. I should be able to immediately do it almost, again, by instinct. And muscle memory is a very big point, especially for people who play games competitively, in terms of memorizing button combinations. And again, the insane hand-eye coordination that goes into playing games like that and StarCraft. But back to the topic at hand, primary actions again should be assigned to buttons that are easiest or that are the easiest to reach. In some cases, your hand will just be resting on it. Again, if I'm going to be using WSAD for movement, then naturally I could have E as a button for using items or stuff like that because it's not a huge shift. Now, in terms of button placements, when it comes to secondary actions, again, you're a little bit more open, but you don't want to go too far out of the reins. Again, if I'm using my thumbsticks constantly for control or camera, then I don't want to have to shift my hand to maybe hit up direction to use an essential skill. And two signs of a novice game designer when it comes to control schemes. The first one is requiring you to shift your hands. Again, if I'm going like this, I may have to shift up. Or maybe sometimes when I'm playing a Souls game, I kind of have to go like this with my controller because I'm focusing with the camera while constantly trying to attack. Now, in some cases, you can get around this. Again, we are dealing with, at most, 8 input buttons, 2 control sticks, and a directional pad. So, the more commands you have, the less you're going to have to work with, in a sense. But the other problem, this is typically seen in keyboards, is when a designer will basically go all over the place. You'll have keys at WSAD, then maybe you'll have some at HJK. And then there are developers who like to use function keys for shortcuts and hotkeys. Pro tip, don't use function keys for any major or even secondary action for your game. Again, the less the player has to shift their hands, the better your control scheme is going to be. Now, with that said though, the next point, this is when we get a little bit more deeper, is the idea of differentiating your hands here. When it comes to primary actions, again, because of how consistent you're going to use them, it's better to try to keep the primary actions balanced between the two hands. If my left hand over here is going to be moving, then my right hand should be responsible for jumping or shooting, or whatever the primary action of your game is going to be. And the reason is, if I'm busy having to manipulate my character using the D-pad or the analog stick, there we go, then it's going to be a lot harder for me to also press either a D-pad or a trigger button when I'm trying to be so involved with movement. And we see this again, it's a very simple technique here, but it works. If I'm going to be moving with the left analog stick, then shooting will usually be a right trigger or square or X. Jumping is the same way. And to prove my point, try this for if you want to see how crazy it is. For a game that allows you to remap your keys, instead of using X or right trigger as a jump or shoot, make it left trigger, and just see how effective you are at manipulating a thumbstick while still processing up here for the trigger. For some of you, you'll be able to handle it easily, but it's still going to feel very awkward when you're trying to control. So when it comes to setting up your primary actions like that, again, try to spread out between your hands. Now, secondary actions, again, you're a little bit more loose. Because they are situational, you don't need to worry as much about differentiating the hands. But if you're trying to manipulate, let's say, the camera with your right thumb, and you're still trying to perform an important action, try to keep it to a finger that is free. Which in this case, if I'm using the right thumb, my index finger up here will still be free to hit these buttons. Now the final point, and this is where we can get a little bit more, I guess, down the weeds, are secondary or extra things you can do to streamline your control scheme. I said a few minutes ago regarding secondary associations. And besides stuff like the right trigger, you can also do things like the position of the buttons corresponding to the power or the hands. So, for instance, in Demon Souls or any of the Souls titles, the right side over here will correspond to the right hand actions, left buttons, left side. Again, it's not complicated, but it's these little things that can make it easier to associate. I mentioned Assassin's Creed as a good example using its paper doll interface of X being for your feet, square and circle being for hands, triangle being for like head-related actions. Speaking of Assassin's Creed, there's also the idea of having a button modifier. The modifier essentially will change your entire control scheme, or most of it, to represent different actions. So you could have, let's say, the stealth actions, and then if I hold down or press L1 or L2, we go into action or aggressive. So instead of maybe knocking someone out, now I kill them. Instead of walking, now I run, and so on. But there's also the idea of associating things to places on the UI. This is especially true for the keyboard. One of the biggest shifts in terms of standardization or streamlining came with moving away from word association when it came to button presses. And anyone who's played old school games know what I'm talking about here. Opening a door would be O for open, or D for door. Health would be H for health, or P for potion. Again, we can just go down the dictionary here. And again, that led to that crazy control scheme of I have to look at my entire keyboard to know what buttons do what. And one of the things, for instance, that StarCraft 2 did was it changed the UI hotkey. So if you remember, the hotkey bar or the command bar is like right there on the screen, and the button presses that correspond to them are represented by their position in that UI. So the upper left one would be, like if we start from Q, R, A, and F, upper left would be Q, next one would be W, E, R, and so on. That way I just keep one hand here and I can hit all the hotkeys that I want. And again, you know you have a good control scheme when someone doesn't have to look at the keyboard or the gamepad and there aren't any shifting of hands going on. Now, we could keep talking about this, and I'm sure there are other tips or little things that you've seen. And if there are any really good examples that I've missed, or you would like me to elaborate on, or you would like to talk about, let me know in the comments below. But to wrap up our talk, when it comes to creating an effective control scheme for your game, again, it's a thankless job. And because of that, it can be hard to get an accurate measure. And so the magic word for today is playtesting. You should have people looking at your game, and you yourself should be playing it to see how the control scheme works. If something feels awkward or people are complaining, then that's usually the sign that you need to adjust. And one other point I want to make. When it comes to mapping your control scheme, control remapping is an important quality of life feature, but it's not the secondary, it's not the solution to not having a good, wow, my mind just completely blanked there. Let me rephrase that. Keyboard or gamepad mapping is not the solution to having a poor control scheme or not thinking of it. Because at the end of the day, if you are building the game, you should know the best way to play it. And the consumers, again, will thank you for it. And by thank you, I mean not complain about or send angry messages. And again, this is a very interesting topic. I remember I was playing a game on Twitch when XP was asking me about control schemes. So I was basically playing the game while talking about the game, while thinking of the control scheme and trying to ask him about it as well. It was a lot of fun. I love that kind of multitasking. But again, when it comes to mapping gamepads or keyboard and mouse, it just takes a lot of time. But understanding things like the neutral position, primary and secondary actions, and those little things you can do to make things easier are all effective ways of improving as a game designer. And again, when it works, no one will say anything at all. But one last question for you folks. Can you think of examples, other than what I've mentioned, of games that have had really good control schemes or really good gamepad layouts, and why? Because again, this is something that we normally don't talk about or even think about. Because of how muscle memory works and the state of flow when it comes to playing games, once you enter that, you're not really thinking about the hunk of plastic in your hands here. But with that said, thank you so much for watching today's Critical Thought. If you are new and you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. Check back for daily discussions on game design here and on Game Wisdom, where we examine the art and science of games. And let me know if there's any other topics you'd like me to cover in a future vlog. But because I'm recording these videos a day in advance, or I'm sorry, a day before, have a happy 4th of July for those of you watching this today. But until next time, have a great night. Thank you so much for watching this video. If you enjoyed it, be sure to like and subscribe to the channel. And come back around 10 Eastern for regular streaming. For a collection of my writings as well as weekly podcasts on game development, be sure to check out game-wisdom.com. Follow me on Twitter at GWBycer for updates throughout the day. And to help support everything that I do, you can find me on Patreon under GWBycer or Game Wisdom. Your donations can help to keep things running, and we hit some goals, it will mean more content for everyone to enjoy. So, thanks again for watching, and be sure to come back for daily discussions on game design on the Game Wisdom channel.